Coming up on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto this week, even with the federal government shutdown now reaching a month, multiple reports say that President Trump could reschedule cannabis this month. We'll talk with NORML's political director, Morgan Fox.
Yeah, anybody in Ohio who cares about voting rights and individual liberty, but also the responsibility of politicians to support the will of their constituents, should be appalled at what's happening right now.
Ohio legislators continue to roll back adult use cannabis rules while recriminalizing purchases from out of state. On top of that, they want even tougher restrictions on THC-infused hemp beverages and products. Plus, in Massachusetts, violence on the streets of Fall River, where a former mayor gets attacked outside the dispensary he works at. Will Flanagan is now in serious condition in the hospital while police arrest the alleged person responsible for that attack. And in Florida, Smart and Safe Florida is suing the state over tactics to invalidate over 200,000 signatures collected to put the adult use question back on the ballot for 2026. And what will you be dressing up as on Halloween? We've got cannabis-themed ideas for you all on our international reports and on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Alaina Pinto next.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Cannabis Coast to Coast News, WPCM-TV's weekly documentation of the fight to end cannabis prohibition in this country and around the world. I'm Alaina Pinto. Last week, we told you about a weed whisperer at the White House who called rescheduling good politics. And now, word out of the White House is that the president might finally impact federal reform by rescheduling cannabis at the federal level before the end of this month, which is only a few days away. But don't count on that. In fact, you might want to wager on what will come first, rescheduling or the government reopening. Executive producer Jimmy Young talked to NORML's political director Morgan Fox for an update on that and a few other hot button issues in the states, including Ohio.
Thanks, Alaina. And again, anytime there's something going on nationally, federally, or even in each state, NORML is really the go-to source to talk to. And we're so happy and lucky to have someone like Morgan Fox in the speed dial, if you will, of the Cannabis Coast to Coast News resources. And Morgan, thank you so much for joining me here. And we could talk a little bit about what the specifics are in Ohio, but to me, the bigger picture is legislators not agreeing to what ballot questions have been handed them as law, and they want to change it. This is actually a big slap in the face again to our democratic system, isn't it?
Yeah, anybody in Ohio who cares about voting rights and individual liberty, but also the responsibility of politicians to support the will of their constituents, should be appalled at what's happening right now. The fact that they're not only changing what voters approved in issue 2 back in 2023, but are also doing so in a rushed fashion and not providing the people really time to even read the law, let alone speak up about it before they're holding votes on it, is really just horrific.
And speaking of that kind of thing, here in Massachusetts, I'm sure you know that the SAM group is behind an initiative to get a rollback the adult use cannabis market onto the ballot in 2026. That supposedly, according to reports, they're close to their limit of 76,000 signatures. They keep saying they're going to get to 100,000. What's going on here? I mean, Massachusetts is supposed to be a cradle of liberty here, and it's been a pretty vibrant market, but it looks like Sam is trying to exert their influence on these kinds of states.
Well, this is just another example, including Ohio, of massive attempts to roll back our hard-fought victories over the last decade or so. Just to backtrack a little bit, in Ohio, what the House just approved in their rush vote in addition to some legislation that I think is really the key aspect of it, which is some hemp regulation, which is pretty restrictive, or synthetics regulation. But this bill will restrict the places that people are able to legally consume cannabis. It makes it so that you're only allowed to keep 2.5 ounces of your harvest from a home cultivation in your house at any time. It makes it illegal to possess cannabis that was not purchased in Ohio or that you can prove was grown at home in Ohio. And it makes it so that it is impossible to carry cannabis that is not in its original unopened container or in the trunk of your car. These are things that are going to result in more arrests, more enforcement costs, and significantly less freedom for Ohioans. In Massachusetts, we're seeing an effort by a number of well-funded prohibitionists to put a ballot initiative out there that would essentially recriminalize the regulated cannabis market, as well as create a pathway for additional penalties for even simple possession, as well as other cannabis-related behavior that's innocuous and victimless. We're starting to hear reports that voters are being misled when they are signing the petitions to get this thing on the ballot, which I certainly would not put it past most prohibition groups. So I think that it really just highlights that our fight is not over, even post-legalization. We need to keep working on state legislators to protect the rights of cannabis consumers, and we need to stay vigilant for attempts to roll back these laws coming from private organizations, and make sure to hold their feet to the fire the way that they have with us for years. I'm talking about challenging the petition counts. I'm talking about challenging the methodology. They've been litigating against us for years, and it's time to give them a taste of their own medicine.
One more note from Washington, D.C. The U.S. Supreme Court will be ruling on whether regular users of cannabis should be banned from owning guns. Cases like these have been challenged in lower courts, but now the Supreme Court will rule on the constitutionality of the right to bear arms if you are a regular consumer or patient using cannabis. Of course, it might help sway that ruling if the president decides to move on the rescheduling of cannabis to Schedule 3 of the CSA. That at least will recognize the plant with medicinal value and move it off Schedule 1, a place where it has lived since 1971 under then President Richard Nixon. Next up, the battle continues in Ohio, where the legislature there continues to try to roll back some of the gains that industry made at the ballot box last year. The House in Ohio passed a very controversial bill this past week that limits THC percentage and recriminalizes out-of-state purchases. Plus, they put more severe regulations over THC-infused beverage products. And when it comes to hemp, we are lucky to have Kerry Hinkle every week. Here's his report this week.
Hi there, I'm Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp out of Houston, Texas, and I'm back again with another hemp report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This week, we turn our attention back to Ohio, where you may remember recently the governor, Mike DeWine, issued an executive order attempting to ban all hemp products. Now, this executive order has been stopped in the courts, a temporary restraining order has been issued, and a hearing date has now been pushed into December. So while the governor has not been able to unilaterally ban these products, part of the political messaging in the executive order was to put pressure on the legislature to finally enact some regulations on hemp products. For years now, we've seen bills die in the State House that had varying degrees of restrictions on THC limits and where you could sell the products, and yet every bill has continued to fail. And that's why the governor issued his executive order, and that's now why this week we saw SB 56 sail its way through the House Judiciary Committee. This bill is quite interesting in that it allows for 5 milligram THC beverages to be sold on draft in restaurants and bars, and anything up to 10 milligrams of THC on the beverage side can be sold in mainstream channels like convenience stores and grocery. Whereas edibles and gummies of 1 milligram of THC and below are fine, but anything above that 1 milligram mark would now be restricted to hemp dispensary licensees and the traditional regulated cannabis market. So For some reason, a 1 milligram gummy, you have to go to a dispensary, but a 10 milligram beverage, you can go to Kroger and buy, theoretically. The bill has not made it through the Senate yet, and we understand a conference committee could be assigned if the Senate disagrees with this approach, and some more deal making has to be done. But the reason I want to report on this state and specifically this bill is it's emblematic as the alcohol industry continues to lobby on behalf of the protections of hemp-derived THC beverages, and perhaps that forsakes other categories like tinctures, tablets, and topicals. So we will continue to report as SB 56 moves in Ohio. And for Bayou City Hemp and Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Kerry Hinkle. We'll see you again next week.
With more details on what's going on in her state of Ohio, here's Christina Brisson.
I'm Christina Brisson with Over the Top Renovations with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News. So let's talk about what's happened here recently. So now the Ohio legislation, as of the House, has passed Senate Bill 56 with the 18th revision of all the different clauses and what it's going to cover and not cover. So it's going to go back to the Senate. And as you all know, like I said, we've done this 1,000 times already with this bill and a lot of different language differences. This bill is talking about allowing 400 dispensaries of hemp, intoxicating hemp dispensaries, I should say. It's not specifying, from what I saw, between medical dispensaries and not, and how those licenses are going to work, and or what those fees are going to be. So we're going to see what that is going to look like and what those details are going to entail. So hopefully that will be that happy medium we need between these businesses here in Ohio and the dispensaries, where you're not paying $400,000 for a license, but also our products are safe for the public. So hopefully more on that is going to come. Again, I am Christina Brisson with Over the Top Renovations with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The state of Florida has the nation's largest medical cannabis program with over 800,000 registered patients. The governor there, Ron DeSantis, continues to treat that industry like public enemy number one. However, that hasn't deterred the Smart and Safe Florida group. They are the advocates who are trying to get the adult use question back on the ballot in the fall of 2026. And you might remember that the pro cannabis vote came up a few percentage points short of its goal of 60%, which by state law will change the Constitution in order to become law. So the Smart and Safe Florida group has been busy out collecting hundreds of thousands of signatures. Again, getting those signatures verified is now the next battle, and the Smart and Safe group is now going to court. That group is suing the state of Florida over their verification process that they continue to rig against their efforts. Nothing is easy in the cannabis industry, and governments continue to make it as difficult as possible to use the tools allowed for political change, like a ballot question. The battlefield for hemp is also not an easy road for industry, and now that battle is coming to Arizona. Karen Black has that story in her Arizona report.
I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting with the Arizona Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. We have an update on the ongoing battle between the Hemp Industry Trade Association of Arizona and Attorney General Chris Mays. The Arizona Court of Appeals has officially scheduled oral arguments for November 14th on whether the state can legally ban Delta 8, Delta 10, and THC-infused beverages from unlicensed retailers. The temporary stay remains in effect, meaning these intoxicating hemp products can continue to be sold while the case proceeds. And there's a parallel playing out with another plant-based substance. A recent investigation shows unregulated magic mushroom products are flooding Arizona head shops and liquor stores. These aren't psilocybin. They're legal Amanita muscaria mushrooms marketed as psychoactive supplements. Industry watchers say it's the same regulatory gray zone that allowed hemp-derived cannabinoids to proliferate before AG Mays stepped in. The question now, will the state crack down on mushrooms the same way it did with hemp? Meanwhile, Tucson's D2 Dispensaries is tackling a different kind of sustainability challenge. The company launched EcoPride.com, an educational initiative addressing Arizona's cannabis water consumption crisis. D2 publicly disclosed that its operations use an average of 143,000 gallons monthly, and the company has cut that by 40% over 2 years using enclosed irrigation and filtration systems. D2 is now calling for statewide production limits and industry-wide transparency as legislators weigh water regulation for cannabis cultivation. That focus on conservation may become even more critical as Arizona eyes future growth. A recent study from the University of Nevada ranks Arizona 8th nationally for cannabis export potential once federal rescheduling allows interstate commerce. With Arizona's greenhouse-grown flower selling at just $600 a pound, among the cheapest in the West, more operators may want to think seriously about water management if the state is positioned to compete with California, Nevada, and Colorado in cross-border sales. Lastly, in Mesa, the Earl Cup held its Fall Cannabis Awards Festival last weekend. Thousands turned out for the consumer-judged competition that Secret shops dispensaries statewide. Winners will be announced once all laboratory testing is complete, and results will be posted at theearlcup.com. That's all for this week's Arizona Report. I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Back here on the East Coast, a very upsetting story emerged this week with a random act of senseless violence. It happened in the city of Fall River, Massachusetts, which is located 52 miles south of the state capital, Boston. A former mayor of Fall River, Will Flanagan, was attacked outside the dispensary he runs and is now in serious condition in the hospital. The man responsible for that is now in custody, and Curtis Emery has more in his Bay State Report.
I'm Curtis Emery, a bud tender from Resonate in Worcester, Massachusetts, with the Bay State Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. It's been a sombering news week here in the Commonwealth. Our first story, an act to restore sensible marijuana policy, an initiative which seeks to wipe out the licensed adult use cannabis sales and market here in the state, is apparently well on its way to reaching 100,000 signatures by December 3rd. Now, if the petition can gain those signatures, it needs about 73,000 more signatures to reach that 100,000 minimum. It will find itself as a ballot question on next year's voting cycle in November 2026. Surely would be a huge hit to the industry, not to mention the customers all over the state who are currently taking advantage of adult use sales. Also in the news, former Fall River Mayor Will Flanagan was stabbed in broad daylight outside of a dispensary which he is CEO. The former mayor was stabbed in the neck while outside of his dispensary. The cannabis industry is surely watching this as it unfolds. It's not clear whether or not the motive had anything to do with his establishment. However, for those of us who work in dispensaries every day, it's definitely sombering to hear of violence near a place of work. Especially at places of work where we see so many people all the time. I've been Curtis Emery with the Bay State Report, Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
There's a mounting concern in the state of Oklahoma where abandoned licensed grow farms have been vacated or shut down. That state started its medical program by handing out licenses like Halloween candy. And now with over 6,000 of these farms abandoned, public health officials believe there is an issue. But now, of course, there is a battle over whose responsibility it is to do something about it. One regulatory group wants the other one to take care of it, and no one seems to have a clue on what to do. That's not the only issue facing the Oklahoma cannabis market, as Kimmie Cannabis explains in her weekly cannabis report from the Sooner State.
I am Kimmie Cannabis with Can I Talk About It with the Oklahoma Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. As I reported last week, many license holders who didn't complete their OBN renewals by September 1st are now facing serious consequences. Companies that failed to secure their Certificate of Occupancy, or COO, have now run out of time. That means they're required to shut down operations on November 1st until they obtain their COO and then completely reapply for their OBNDD license. Industry members say the state fire marshal's office slow-played inspections and delayed approvals, making it nearly impossible for some operators to comply. Many feel the fire marshal and OBNDD have co-inspired in this bottleneck that is now impacting countless businesses across Oklahoma. In other news, OMMA has issued an embargo on Ruby Mays, LLC. The products in question date back as far as 2022 through 2025. This was not about bad medicine, it was about the process. Ruby maize tested before the entire batch was completed, which is a technical violation of OMMA rules. They tested flour and distillate, passed compliance, and then completed the rest of the batch. Unfortunately, regulations require that all batches be fully produced before testing. Patients statewide are sad to see this happen to a company they've trusted and loved for years. That's it from Can I Talk About It with your Oklahoma Cannabis Coast to Coast report. I'm Kimmie Cannabis. Peace, love, and all that good stuff.
That'll do it for the A Block this week. We have plenty more state reports coming up, as well as the international reports from Europe. Plus, a little later in the program, we'll have the news from New York State, where a major licensee is in trouble after bending the rules on licensing. Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this break.
Your cannabis business could be overpaying by hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal income taxes because of one simple assumption that you're making about your accountant. A dispensary owner in Colorado called me frustrated as hell. He'd been working with the same accountant for 3 years. His accountant said, "What's 471C?" Here's what the ignorance of that accountant was costing this business owner: $180,000 every single year for 3 years. 471C has been around since 2017. We're talking about an 8-year-old tax provision that many cannabis CPAs don't fully understand. 471C is one of the most complex and highly debated tax strategies in the cannabis industry. If you want to make sure you're not leaving any money on the table, I'm offering free 471C reviews this month. Link in the description.
Accounting Buds has grown into Buds Group, the same award-winning quality, now with more service offerings. Buds Group, your best buds in the biz.
Looking for PR that over-delivers on expectations? At Maverick Public Relations, they pair big agency experience with personalized attention. From launching award-winning brands to securing top-tier media hits, their data-driven communications team helps visionary leaders and entrepreneurs rise above the media noise. Maverick PR is responsive, collaborative, and relentless about results and ROI. Visit themaverickpr.com and make headlines together.
If you want to make history, if you want to be part of history, if you want to say you helped legalize marijuana in America, now is the time to join us.